WFLA Now will begin momentarily. WFLA Now will begin momentarily. Streaming live on WFLA Now, powered by 1-800-ASK-GARY.
And good afternoon, everybody. This is Chief Meteorologist Jeff Berardelli, and we are discussing Hurricane Ian and hurricanes in general during this session. And what you're looking at here is damage video in Fort Myers Beach, Sanibel, that area of Southwest Florida that got hit so hard by Hurricane Ian. A devastating situation. Often I say that getting through the hurricane is sometimes the easy part. The aftermath, cleaning up, that can be arduous because it takes weeks, months, and even in this case, years, because it was such a impactful hurricane, one of the strongest we've ever seen hit the state of Florida in recent history. And I think it's a wake-up call to everyone, anybody who's in the path of hurricanes, of just how devastating these hurricanes can be, and the fact that it does seem like hurricanes are starting to become more destructive. Not only because they, in some cases, are becoming more powerful, but because we have a lot more infrastructure in harm's way. So with that said, I want to bring a specialist on this into the picture. This is Dr. Michael Wehner from Lawrence-Berkeley National Laboratory. I know Michael for a while now. He's been studying the science behind hurricanes and also how our changing climate is affecting hurricanes in general. Michael, thank you for joining us on this stream today.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
So I wanted to kind of get this out of the way because, there's a lot of, I think, misinformation about how climate change may be impacting hurricanes. So, of course, the first and most obvious question is, did climate change cause Hurricane Ian?
Well, no, of course not. The question about causality is a complicated one. For a complex event like a storm, we're more interested in what were all the different causal effects. And climate change was one of those. It caused the storm to be more intense. But the statement we made was that climate change caused the Hurricane Ian to be more than 10% wetter, more than 10% rainier than it would have been without climate change. But without climate change, this would have still been a very devastating storm.
Exactly. So that's a point that we need to drive home, because oftentimes you will hear journalists ask that question, did climate change cause this? And no, of course, climate change doesn't cause the weather, and hurricanes and powerful ones have been around since the dawn of time. So I think that's important to kind of get that out of the way. We have some graphics on one of our weather computers, so we'll just kind of take them one by one. By the way, that is, of course, Hurricane Ian when it made landfall in Florida as a strong Cat 4 hurricane with a fairly large eye and a big eye wall, a large area of hurricane force winds about 80 miles wide. Again, this was no Charlie. Charlie was about the same intensity, but a much smaller core, and it affected, in terms of hurricane force winds, a much smaller area. This one was obviously a lot more devastating. Bigger storms caused a lot more storm surge, and this one, certainly, that is going to be probably what it's remembered for, although it produced all the different impacts, including extraordinarily heavy rain and standing water all across the state, and obviously strong destructive winds as well. So the first question is, if we can bring this full screen, JB, is climate change and hurricanes. So the first question is, does a warming climate cause a greater number of hurricanes, Michael?
Well, this is one of the most debated questions we have right now. most of the simulations we do of a future warmer climate, and even a colder past climate have suggest that a warming climate causes fewer numbers of hurricanes, but a greater number, or at least a greater proportion, of intense hurricanes.
You see what I have up there? That's from your study. And you found that globally, there was a decrease in number of about 13% since the late 1800s and 28% from, so globally 13% in the Atlantic, 28% decrease in tropicals, not hurricanes, but tropical systems overall.
Right. But that's from the pre-industrial era.
Right.
And where there's been a lot of warming. The Atlantic is particularly confusing in some sense because we also have the presence of what we call sulfate aerosols, basically air pollution from burning high sulfur oil and coal. And since the Clean Air Act, there's been a reduction in air pollution. That's a good thing. But there's also been, we believe, an associated increase in Atlantic hurricanes as it returns to the air pollution tended to suppress tropical cyclone formation.
We have that graphic. You can see it on the screen.
Yeah,
That's
you can see it there. And that less active period of the 70s and 80s is when air pollution was at its worst. I'm old enough to remember that. And so it's sort of one of these unintended consequences. You do a good thing.
Yeah, you clean up the atmosphere.
You clean up the atmosphere. It's a good thing. I mean, air pollution causes a lot of health problems locally, but we did get more storms for it as it sort of returns more to what it might have once been if there hadn't been some warming. Of course, the warming is decreasing. So you sort of have these offsetting effects, which makes this a scientifically interesting region.
Right. Yeah, that is really interesting. We've seen this recent spike, and so anybody who's been paying attention over the last 20 years has to think, well, climate change must be causing more storms because we've seen more storms in the Atlantic Ocean, but that's not necessarily the case all across the world. In fact, where pollution has gone up in the Western Pacific, I understand, and I think I remember this from the NOAA report that was, a few months ago, that overall storm numbers have gone down in the Western Pacific.
Yes, and you have to remember there are a lot more storms in the Western Pacific than in the Atlantic, and our statements about the numbers decreasing in a future warmer world or a presently warmer world are based on the global statistics. And the West Pacific, if the West Pacific declines, then the global number declines. And so one of the interesting scientific things is that the Atlantic could respond differently than the Pacific. That's still a research question.
Great. Okay, so let's move on to the next question because I do want to get to questions from our viewers in about 10 minutes or so. So the next question is, does a warming climate cause stronger hurricanes? And I know again here it's a bit of a gray area, but what do you say to that?
Well, we've known for some time that warmer water makes stronger hurricanes. Just from looking at the pattern of the observational record. And of course, with global warming, the water gets warmer. And so we've long expected that the number of intense hurricanes, and more importantly, perhaps, is that the intensity of the most intense ones will become higher. By intensity, I mean wind speeds. And you're showing the statement we wrote for the IPCC. I helped craft that statement, actually. And we very carefully said that it's the proportion of major hurricanes that have increased, and the proportion will continue to increase because it's sort of related to this question of the total number. If the total number were to decrease a lot, then the number of intense hurricanes might actually go down, or it actually could maybe go up for a while and then go down as we get warmer and warmer. And so those are still sort of unknown things.
Right, but the idea behind it is that if you see a decrease in overall hurricane numbers by, let's say, a little, but you also have an increase in the strongest of hurricanes, then proportionally speaking, that's why you worded it that way, we'd see an increase in the number of most intense cyclones.
That's exactly it. And I can't overstress the fact that the worst storms will be even more intense than the record storms that we've we seem to be having in recent years.
So JB, if you can bring the computer back, and I'm going to advance it. Let's put this next graphic full, if you can. And this again is this. What I'm going to say is from the paper, by the way, Michael, by James Elsner, and I think is it? I don't know if it's James Elsner, but it's Elsner and Cosin back in 2008, I believe. And so this is the number that they quoted there, approximately, that for the strongest of storms, they become 10% stronger with a 1 degree increase Fahrenheit in water temperature. Thus, if you had a storm of, and this is again, I'm putting this out as an example. If you have an extremely intense hurricane on par with, let's say, Ian, you might be able to see a 15 mile an hour increase in wind speeds. Now, you may or may not agree with it, but again, I'm getting the specific number from that Elsner paper back in 2008. What do you have to say about that from your research?
I don't disagree with it by any means. But on the other hand, this has been a very difficult thing to detect and then later attribute to climate change. And the reason is that the Saffir-Simpson scale, which is a great scale for communicating one aspect of hurricanes, is that it's a point-wise instant measure. So it's the highest speed anywhere at an instant in the storm. And so that means it's a very noisy field, sort of imprecise to actually measure exactly. And when we talk about rain, I'll tell you why I think that we actually are seeing stronger wind speeds, even though we haven't been able to detect it in this noisy field of peak wind speed, instantaneous peak wind speed.
And of course, I did this climate segment on air yesterday. I did it online, and what I did with this is I talked about potential intensity rather than intensity, because mathematically it's a little bit easier to say, well, if the water temperatures are 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, then you might see 15% stronger storm or 10% stronger storm, whatever it is, than it is to actually measure that in real life. So the potential intensity of systems based upon this Elsner-Cosin paper back in 2008, such that 1 degree Fahrenheit of warming causes a storm to be a strong storm, an intense storm to be about 10% stronger. Again, potential intensity probably being the better way to couch that.
Yeah, indeed. That's a commonly used index developed by Kerry Emanuel at MIT.
Okay. So then the next question is, how about climate change and more rapid intensification? Are we actually seeing that, or is it just kind of an illusion based upon?
Well, apparently we are. I wasn't involved in that study, but there is a paper out that detects a change in rapid intensification of the most intense storms. And while I expect that is almost certainly due to warmer atmosphere, warmer oceans, to climate change, we haven't been able to do a formal attribution. And by that, I mean, what's an attribution? An attribution statement is sort of a fingerprint where we are able to say, some kind of a model that without climate change this thing didn't happen, and with climate change it did. And because we're limited in our modeling ability of rapid intensification, those kinds of experiments, numerical experiments, haven't been done. But I would suggest that it's something we should do, and the rather small attribution community needs to start paying more attention to rapid intensification.
Yeah, so we're looking at Ian, and Ian rapidly intensified 35 miles an hour in 3 hours. Now, some of that might have been due to the fact that perhaps the National Hurricane Center's estimate at 4 a.m., the day of landfall, might have been an underestimate, but it was 120 miles an hour, and then when the hurricane hunter flew in, they found it to be 155. So it's possible that, it was stronger than 120 at 4 a.m., but the bottom line is that it did rapidly intensify in the several hours leading up to around landfall or just before landfall. And of course, there's a difference in a person's mind when they're facing down a storm with winds of 120 miles an hour versus a storm of 155 miles an hour. And I think that's really, of course, the danger is that, people are like, well, I've been through a Cat 3, and most people really haven't, but people think they have. And so, there's the danger of, well, I've been through a Cat 3, so I think I'll be fine. But then, of course, it turns out that it's a Cat 4. And it was forecasted, by the way, to be a Cat 4 by the National Hurricane Center. So the reason why I'm bringing this up now is I'm showing the satellite, the visible satellite of Ian as it made landfall.
Well, as I referred to earlier, I mean, the Saffir-Simpson scale is what it is, and it's well known, but it doesn't convey all the dangers, and not all Cat 3 storms are the same. And for instance, Hurricane Sandy was only Cat 2, and I think maybe Cat 1 at landfall.
Yep.
And look at but it was an enormous, massive storm, and by some measures, it was the second largest Atlantic storm ever. And Ian is another case of an enormous storm. It had an enormous footprint as it made landfall, and so that the storm surge was large, and the area impacted was terribly large.
I think there was a paper out within the past couple of months about kind of suggestions of how to change the Saffir-Simpson scale so that it can encompass not just wind, that it's a surge, rainfall, that it's an impact system. I don't know for sure, or it's going to come out soon. One of those two.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that, but I do think that there is a need for better communication of the danger of these storms, and maybe that's the scale, the danger scale, or something. Oh,
let's see. We lost Michael for a second. Well, while we have lost Michael, I will tell you. Oh, you're back. Hey, Michael,
Yeah.
let me tell our viewers something real quick. If you want to send us a question, send it to #HeyMichael or #HeyJeff. So #HeyMichael, #HeyJeff, so that JB, who's on the switchboard right now, can get these questions on the air. Okay, so we lost you for about 10 seconds or so. Why don't you finish your last thought?
Mainly that, the National Hurricane Center is they're the best in the business, and they do these forecasts of storm surge, which are remarkably accurate. They call them experimental, but they're still they need to be paid attention to. And so that's the thing to communicate is when the National Hurricane Center says it's dangerous, believe them.
Yes.
It is.
I think, yeah, and I think a lot of people did. I think a lot of people did in fact evacuate. Not everybody, and that's always the problem.
I'm sure that most people did.
Yeah.
It's those who don't, who think, oh, I did this hurricane, I did that hurricane, and you maybe were lucky,
yeah,
or maybe you really didn't experience the full force of a storm like Ian. And so it's better to be safe than sorry, I think.
All right, so let's move on to the next one, which is your specialty for sure, which is more extreme rainfall. So is a warming climate causing more extreme rainfall?
And the answer to that is yes. And in fact, the words I've been using to describe how climate change actually supercharges the rainfall in intense hurricanes. And we know from an old 19th century relationship developed for steam engines that the humidity in a fully saturated environment like a hurricane increases at about 5% per degree Fahrenheit of warming. But we routinely find on these attribution studies I referred to that the rainfall has been increased by substantially more than that 5% per degree of Fahrenheit warming. And in Ian, we said it was 10%, about more than 10%, so more than twice as much, more than twice the increase in rain as there was increase in humidity. And we've seen this again and again for a lot of different storms. Hurricane Harvey was almost 3 times the moisture increase for the rainfall. And so for a long time I was sort of puzzled with this. Why is this? And I think I know the answer now. It's just that what we're really seeing here is that elusive increase in wind speed. So it doesn't take much of an increase in sort of the overall energy of the storm to make the storm more efficient at raining out this increased available moisture. And so I think that's the most plausible explanation for why there's this supercharging going on.
Yeah, I have this, and I've thought about that too for a while. And, obviously a hurricane is like an octopus, right? It has arms in every different direction. It's scooping up all that extra moisture. If you have 10% more moisture in the atmosphere, you're kind of acting to converge that moisture towards the center. So these storms are really efficient moisture convergence machines. And not only that, They're also, theoretically, if you have more moisture, you have more heat, latent heat, of course, we call it in meteorology, and you're able to kind of power a stronger hurricane, which can produce higher rainfall rates. So it's not just extra moisture, it's also the mechanics of the hurricane. Is that right?
Yeah, that's how I understand it. That's my best estimate of what's going on now.
So then that brings me to this, which is, you guys put out a statement saying that Hurricane Ian's rainfall was about 10% higher than it would have otherwise been because of climate change. But do you think the estimate at the end, when you finally get to really do your attribution, is going to be higher than 10%?
Well, we carefully said more than 10%.
Okay.
And we also said using peer-reviewed methods, and it was based on an article that Kevin Reed and I and other collaborators had published earlier in the year, looking at the entire 2020 hurricane season. And for convenience, we did rather a simple analysis and looking at the 2020 season rather than looking at each storm individually. But in this case, we'll look at the storm individually. We look at it in different ways, and that's likely to provide more insight and possibly a larger statement. But we didn't want to make that statement because those ways of analyzing we don't have in a peer-reviewed scientific paper, and so we didn't want to make that.
Right,
so,
you want to be somewhat conservative with that. So we saw about 13 inches of rain in 6 hours. In fact, I have the graphic to show that. I'm going to go back. If JB, if you can go to that. We showed this once, but I'll show it again. So we had 13 inches of rain in about 6 hours in parts of our area. The criteria for a once in a 1,000-year event, according to NOAA, is about 9 inches. So we superseded that by a lot. Is there any guesstimate or estimate on if it's not a once in a 1,000-year event, is it a once in 5,000-year event, 10,000-year event? I mean, I don't know. I think you have to do some actual statistics on it to know for sure. You can't just take a guess, right?
Yeah, we have to do the math. And as we were discussing earlier, I'm here in Chicago at a meeting at the University of Chicago on the statistics of extreme values, extreme weather. And what we will do is go back and look at the observational record in Florida, in this part of Florida, and make a more sophisticated estimate of not only what the return period, that's the 1,000-year thing that we call that, statisticians call that a return period. We want to know how that changed. For hurricane, like we were talking about earlier, for Hurricane Harvey, we estimated that when it occurred in 2017, that it was a 1 in 3,000-year event. But had that storm happened in 1950 or in the pre-industrial, extrapolating back a little bit farther, it would have been about a 1 in 30,000-year event. And so we would have, our statement there was that our best estimate was the rainfall in Harvey was 10 times more likely. But again, scientists being a conservative bunch, we actually made another statement that was about our lower estimate, our lower bound, and we said that it was likely that it was at least 4 times increased. The probability of the event likely increased by a factor of 4, and likely was carefully chosen to match the calibrated IPCC language, which is a whole nother.
Yeah. I just want to say for everyone watching right now, scientists are an extraordinarily conservative bunch. So they don't make these statements lightly. I know there are a lot of people that like to doubt climate change and doubt its impacts on extreme weather. But I will say, from having worked with a lot of scientists in my time, that to get them to say anything definitively is very difficult. And I'm kind of on I'm a scientist, I'm also a journalist, and of course we're always trying to get them to say, hey, is it yes or is it a no? Is it, no gray area, is it black, is it white? And so scientists are very careful. So when they say that, this is a lot more likely now because of climate change, they really mean it. All right, so we have a question from a viewer, and I just want to say one more time, if you have a question, send it to Hey Jeff or Hey Michael. Again, Hey Jeff or Hey Michael. So the first question that we have for you is about to be put on the screen. Hey Jeff, hey Michael, will predictions of the number of hurricanes change due to climate change? So we kind of touched on this, Michael, but I'll let you handle that. Will predictions of the number of hurricanes change due to climate change?
Well, in some sense, it depends on who you ask. Most of the modelers would suggest that globally, the number will decrease.
And I think that's a big surprise for people. I think when people hear that, it's a big surprise to hear that climate change may actually cause less hurricanes, but it's really in the weeds. Even I sometimes have trouble understanding. I mean, there's different reasons why scientists say it could happen and we could see less hurricanes. It becomes really technical, really technical.
It does, but I think the important thing to know is that that decrease will be at the lower end of the wind speed scale. And so
Cat 1s, Cat 2s, or tropical storms, right?
Yeah, tropical storms, especially Cat 1s. Cat 2s is kind of, in my simulation stays about the same, and 3s, 4s, and 5s goes up. And so, from a hazard point of view, it doesn't really matter so much that the number of weak storms goes down if the number of strong storms is going up.
A NOAA analysis from years ago basically stated that 85% of damage from tropical systems comes from major hurricanes, so Cat 3s, Cat 4s, and Cat 5s. So even if you were to decrease the number of tropical storms, Cat 1s and Cat 2s, that's only counts for 15% of the damage or so. At least that was the NOAA estimate from years ago. I don't know if they've updated that since. And I always say to people, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, Michael.
I think that's still the case.
And the other thing I always say is I think that people find this fascinating. If you compare a storm with winds of 75 miles an hour and a storm with winds of 150 miles an hour, I think the natural response is, well, the storm with winds of 150 miles an hour would produce twice the amount of damage, or 4 times, or 10 times, or 20 times. But at least according to the one paper that I looked at from NOAA, it could be as high as 250 times more damage just for a storm with winds of 75 versus a storm with winds of 150 miles an hour. Now, obviously, that's just an estimate. It varies depending upon a lot of things, but it gives you an idea of the magnitude of change in terms of damage potential based upon a doubling of the wind speed. Is that right?
Well, yes, and in fact, there's one index that describes damages as the cube of the wind speed. Energy scales as the square, and damages go as the cube. That's sort of related to something called Stokes' law, which tells you about friction.
I remember Stokes. I probably failed that section in my degree.
That's also a measure of the frictional force of say wind on an object increases the cube of the wind speed, and so damages also have been demonstrated to scale at that rate. And so a little bit of an increase in wind speed can do a lot more damage.
So again, for the folks at home who are watching right now on YouTube and on Facebook, if you have a question, it's Hey Michael and Hey Jeff. Hey Michael and Hey Jeff. So we're looking at kind of a loop of the storm as it made landfall there. And what was, I think, astonishing to a lot of meteorologists was the amount of lightning near the core of that storm as it made landfall. NOAA flew into it early in the morning. They encountered a tremendous amount of turbulence. We had a couple of hurricane hunters on this week who described what it felt like to fly through. One of them saying that he, in his 6 years doing this, has never experienced a storm with as much chaos and turbulence as this storm. And so we knew we were looking at a monster as it made its way towards the coast. You have that much vertical motion. You have that many, lightning bolts in it. What struck you about Ian? Because you watched it make landfall as well, obviously.
Well, the first thing is that so soon after Fiona, which caused so much damage in Puerto Rico. It seems like we didn't get a respite. But from this animation you're showing, the storm surge is they made a great prediction of it, but you can tell by looking at it the angle that it made impact on the Florida coastline was pretty much the worst case. Yep. I think it's hard to imagine it being any more worse from a storm surge potential. And of course, that saltwater flooding causes incredible amounts of damage.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because I built a graphic and I don't have it in this show loaded, but see that coastline right there, Fort Myers Beach, you can see on the south end of the storm, it's like a right angle, right? So right where it turns from Fort Myers Beach over to Sanibel Island, it's hard to see, and I don't have it labeled, but on the south side of the eye wall, I mean, that's a right angle. So, not only is there a gentle continental shelf there, which is allowing that water to build up and push on shore, but now you're funneling it into, just like Hurricane Sandy did in New Jersey and New York, you're funneling that water into a right angle, which makes the situation even worse. I would just say that, if this had hit Tampa Bay, just north of Tampa Bay, so somewhere around St. Pete Beach or Clearwater Beach, that would have also been a worst case scenario as well, because you're doing the same thing, right? You're funneling water into a bay.
Well, and a lot of people live there,
right?
And that of course is always a problem. But I do want to talk a little bit about saltwater flooding versus freshwater flooding.
Sure.
And so our statement about the increase in rainfall really will translate, if we can get the right modelers together, to an increase in the freshwater flooding that happened. That most of what I saw on television was after the storm had passed, as water ran through the catchment. And what was the city of flooded? Tampa, I think.
Well, we didn't flood in Tampa, but just south. I mean, it flooded everywhere. I mean, everywhere south of us along the path of the storm on the northwest side. It was standing water everywhere. And I have to say, I've been a meteorologist in Florida for, on and off for over 20 years. And standing water is typically not a problem here. Water recedes decently quickly, but we had saturated ground, and this was a prolific rain producer. And the result is disastrous freshwater flooding. I'll let you respond to that, but then we have another question coming in, Michael.
It just so that it will be interesting to know how the damages, sort of are divided up. I mean, there was the storm surge damage, the saltwater flooding, the freshwater flooding, which would cause damages, as well as wind damage. And it will be interesting to know. I'm sure there will be studies written that partition the costs from the various damaging parts of this horrendous storm, and that's important because it can inform building codes.
Right.
And we know that building codes can reduce the damages in extreme weather events.
And it did in this case because, of course, Hurricane Charlie hit and destroyed places like Punta Gorda, and a lot of the places that were rebuilt since Charlie were able to survive with limited damage. All right, so I'm going to take the next question from our viewers. Let's see what it is. Hey, Jeff, what will happen to the lands and islands that were hit by the hurricane? Will they change the amount of homes and businesses as time goes by if people can't rebuild? It's a great question, and of course, and it's from Lynn. Thank you, Lynn, for the question. Boy, that's not a weather question, a meteorological or climatological question. That is a political will question. Do we think, Michael, that this will change the calculus?
It raises some really difficult questions, and people have been talking about managed retreat from vulnerable areas, and people obviously want to return to their homes. I mean, of course, but is that the wisest thing to do? Everyone's going to have, all the people affected are going to have to ask that question themselves. Now, there may be extenuating circumstances, like, do they have the right insurance? Do they have the stomach to rebuild? I mean, that's a painful process in itself. And so it's a political problem. It's also a political question. It's also a sociological issue that I'm certainly not expert on, but I think, it's the kind of thing that people will have to ask their question. Do I really want to go back, and subject myself to this risk again? I mean, there's no reason to say that a storm like this couldn't happen right here again next year.
Oh yeah, for sure. And listen, I have to say that as someone who's lived here for as long as I have, I really do feel for the people. This is such a difficult situation, and it's going to take so long to recover from. And if you haven't been hit directly, it's hard to empathize to the level that there needs to be empathy in this situation. As a meteorologist and a person who loves the water, is one of the reasons I live in Florida. I've always tended to live on the water, or near the water. And so even meteorologists who know the science, who understand that this could happen again and again and again, still we put ourselves in harm's way because we are people, we want to live, the other 364 days a year. We want to live in a place that is paradise. And I will tell you, when I lived in Miami, I was a meteorologist there. There were two other meteorologists, hurricane experts, who lived right next to me on the water in probably the most vulnerable place, not just in Florida, but the most vulnerable place in Miami Beach. So, it's hard to change society, even for people who are experts in this, I would say.
Well, yeah, I think that's the point. I mean, if you understand the risks, you can choose to accept them or not.
Right.
But beyond that, if you do accept those risks, when there's imminent danger, I'm sure you and your meteorologist friends would take the necessary actions to protect yourself.
We would, but we necessarily can't evacuate. At least I can't, because I will be on the air. That's for sure. But in this particular case, I sent my wife away for a couple of days with our baby as well, because I was worried about her. One more question, and then I'm going to set you free because you have lunch plans. Okay, yes. So let's do this last question. Hey, Jeff. Hey, Michael. Is there any science reason why the path of Ian and Charlie was so similar? Is it due to climate change? Michael, I'll let you feel that one.
The second part is probably not, and if it was, this is only two events, and it's not enough for us to do statistics. Climate is the statistics of weather, and so we need to have a lot of numbers in order to do the statistics. You might be able to actually say more about the path than I, since you're a Florida expert. But it's sort of the way these things go. I mean, a lot of them make that turn
a little earlier,
and where it makes that turn is kind of random.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I do wonder, though, if it's kind of a situation where if it's going to make the turn, it makes it a bit earlier. If it's not going to make the turn, it just heads towards the Panhandle or towards the Big Bend area of Florida. You know what I'd like to see, Michael? That was our last question. Thank you, Abby. I think it was Abby. I'd like to see a scientist run about 10,000 tropical cyclone tracks. And I'm sure that this has been done several times. I just need to get my hands on it, because I want them to run 10,000 tropical cyclone tracks that start in the Caribbean or the Gulf of Mexico, really probably the Caribbean, and see if there's a smaller proportion of them that end up in Tampa Bay, because Tampa Bay has somehow eluded a major hurricane for about 101 years now. So I do wonder if we ran 10,000 storms, simulated them, if we'd see that there were just a lot more that end up in the Panhandle and a lot more that end up in Southwest Florida, and then just kind of a little bit of a minimum around the Tampa Bay area. Because then we'd know that there's at least some meteorological reason why these hurricanes have the big ones have missed the Tampa Bay area. That's at least my wish.
It's a doable calculation, probably not by me, but I know that there are people that have these synthetic track models where you can generate thousands of individual hypothetical storms.
Can you send over email? Can you send me the context, because I want to see if I want to actually get that done.
Yeah,
okay.
I will.
All right. Listen, Michael, thanks so much for joining me. This has been fascinating. I hope the folks at home appreciated it. And now you deserve to go to lunch and have a great weekend.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for the questions. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I want to thank everyone for joining me. If you would like to read more about this, we have an article on WFLA.com right now. It's called "Is Climate Change Impacting Hurricanes?" And you can read about the latest science, the truth, and the fiction behind how climate change impacts tropical systems and hurricanes. Again, thank you for joining me on WFLA Now. And I want to thank JB for punching this behind the scenes. He's making the magic happen. He is the wizard behind the curtain, and not nearly as grumpy as the wizard from The Wizard of Oz, I don't think. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.